We are back here now to talk some more about the free agent market, zoning in just on veteran defensive backs. Why is there little to no interest almost in a lot of these veterans who have all the experience to bring, all the knowledge to bring to these teams? It seems like a no-brainer to add them, but right now we're about 2.5 weeks away from the start of training camp for some of these teams, and still there are a lot of high-caliber defensive backs left on the free agent market. Patrick Peterson being one of them, I would throw him in there. He last played last season for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he has mentioned that he is eager to join a team right before training camp if the opportunity presents itself. But up until now, there has been little noise made around him, along with some of the other names like Xavier Howard, Stephon Gilmore, Justin Simmons, Quandre Diggs. All of these guys were starters on their teams last year, and they're not that old. I'm pretty sure the oldest guy is probably Patrick Peterson. I know he's up there, but the other guys that I mentioned are probably no older than 33, I would guess 34. And like I mentioned, they were all starters last year, and they were mostly released because of salary cap issues, so it's not like their performance was outstandingly bad or anything like that. They were just cut because their teams found it to be a better solution for them in terms of money to not keep them on their team over this offseason. So on his podcast with fellow former defensive back Brian McFadden, All Things Covered, Patrick Peterson asked a simple question about the free agent market for defensive backs and what is his, mindset surrounding why some of these corners aren't off the market yet. He mentioned it here in a question. Very simply, he said, "What do you think it is about the corners and the safety market at this day and age? We know it's a passing league, right? Why do you see so many high-caliber guys who've played at a high level, defensive backs, still free agents right now?" And he makes a good point. That's a fair question to ask. Like I mentioned, they could bring so much in terms of just knowledge, experience, not having to really have a long transition period, and probably picking up a new system quicker than if you bring in a new player, a younger player, things like that. They have already sharpened skill sets that I'm sure they could add to any secondary in the NFL. But like I said, a lot of them still remain, just without hearing anything, not too much interest shown right now. So why is that? It's a good point. It's a passing league. You need more good coverage guys out there to combat some of these crazy skill sets that we're seeing out of quarterbacks nowadays. But I think it's exactly that. I think we go back to this evolving NFL and being more pass heavy. I think that's pretty much the root of the problem, if that makes sense. And you might ask, what I mean by that. Well, quarterbacks are more talented now. I feel like almost all of them can do everything, quite frankly, or they do one specific thing really well. Patrick does almost everything very well. Josh Allen, almost the same thing. Lamar, you could say, runs a little bit better, is a very, very gifted runner. His passing has come a long way, but I think the running ability definitely stands out. CJ Stroud, I think, is another guy that maybe not so mobile, but can pretty much do everything else. Aaron Rodgers up there, the same thing. Joe Burrow, same thing, can do everything. Maybe not the most mobile guy, but he can run when he has to. All these guys are super talented and can pretty much do everything. If they're considered to be one of those guys, they're not going to have a massive flaw up until this point. So because there are so many talented guys, so many guys that seem to just take over games, you'd think you need more great defensive backs to combat all those passing attempts, make it harder for them to complete these passes. But to go along with that, I think the price for some of these veterans is a big thing as well, especially because I think teams are hesitant to pay some of these veteran guys that amount of money, because secondary is almost a position that can be ignored in a way when you're out there, and especially when you have these talented, savvy, extremely smart quarterbacks out there, and not to mention these extremely smart and talented offensive coordinators or head coaches that call the plays. You combine that, like an Andy Reid and a Patrick Mahomes, for example, you can almost go away from some of these talented defensive backs and secondary guys if you scheme it up right, or if you just have an abundance of talent on the offensive side of the ball. You could really just go away from them in a lot of games. It's almost similar to the running backs and the running game and how that's starting to become, or not starting to become, it has already been devalued a ton. And I think, especially for the veterans, maybe not so much the young corners that for some weird reason are available free agents at 25 or 26 years old, but for those veteran guys that are pushing 30s, 29, over 30 years old, I think it's starting to become a little bit devalued to have them out there because in terms of just this passing game, the evolution of the NFL being more pass heavy, a lot of these guys are crazy athletes as well. So by the time you hit 30 and are getting a little bit older, you don't want to discredit these guys of being great athletes and anything like that, but you take a 30-something year old corner and potentially have them in one-on-one coverage against a young, I don't know, Justin Jefferson or a young Jalen Waddle, it's not really much of a competition at that point. More often than not, maybe 8 times out of 10, 7 times out of 10, the wide receiver will win it. And I think that's being a little generous if it's one-on-one against a select veteran corner. It's just not favorable to pay a veteran maybe $17-18 million if that is the asking price for some of them because they are mostly all coming off of massive contracts anyway. They're probably expecting not to take a huge pay cut because they value themselves so high. But when teams look at that and the potential of these young offenses being more creative, you have a lot of more motion going on, a lot more creativity on that side of the ball. They might be a little bit doubtful to go after a 30-something-year-old corner or a safety especially. If one, they could be schemed out of it. If any of these corners doesn't travel, it almost inches it closer to being irrelevant because if you're a great corner and you don't follow the number one wide receiver, then you're not getting paid $18-17 million to cover the number 2 guy if the offense can just scheme their number 1 receiver, motion him away from you, and then they're on the second or third string corner. You know, it doesn't make sense that way. I think that's where some of the doubts come up. And I mentioned it's similar to the running game because if you have a great defense in the running game, you want to establish it, you keep running it, you keep running it, you keep running it. But at some point, I believe that teams on the offensive side of the ball just get to a point where they just give up on it. They think it's not working, and a lot of the times they give up on it too early, and then they become one-dimensional. It's similar to that of a defensive back. Opposing offenses could just ignore that side. If they're absolutely shutting that wide receiver down, that's fine. If you have another very good to at least average wide receiver on the other side that you feel confident in winning that battle against that number 2 corner. And a lot of teams do nowadays. A lot of teams want to sign or want to make sure they sign these free agents to defeat the great teams like the Texans, like the Bengals, like the Chiefs, like the Ravens. All those teams have great weapons outside of just their number 1 guy. So if you just get a veteran, very good defensive back that's 30, 29 years old, but he's doing a very good job on one side on covering the number 1 receiver, let's say, but on the other side, you still have, I don't know, just picking it out of thin air. You look at the Texans. You have, say you bring on Stephon Gilmore to the Jaguars in a divisional battle, high stakes, everything like that. Stephon Gilmore signs for the Jaguars. He's covering Stephon Diggs, completely shutting him down. Stephon, you don't even know he's in the game half the time because Stephon Gilmore is completely shutting him down. All right, well, we're just going to throw it to Tank Dell. We're going to throw it to Nico Collins. We're going to throw it to Dalton Schultz. We're going to run it, dump it off to Joe Mixon. All these things trying to beat these good teams, just bringing on a guy that's being paid a hefty salary to just cover one guy when there's all these other weapons around. It's something that puts a lot of doubt in teams that are trying to sign these guys, at least at this point in time. It's still a little bit early in this offseason, or at least before training camp. There's still 2.5 weeks. A lot could happen in that time. Something could happen tomorrow or as the weekend comes along. But for right now, I think having that doubt isn't too crazy of a thing to happen right now. Just because if you look at the defensive side of the ball as well, I think a lot of stock is placed on pass rushers because it's harder to take away a pass rusher than it is a corner, in my opinion. You're going to have to throw 3 to maybe 4 guys over to that one good defensive end or just outside linebacker to really neutralize him and not have him do anything. A lot of times these guys are beating double teams, triple teams, if the rest of the defense is set up the right way. And with a corner, you can't really do that at the same time to get him to not be ignored as much as an outside linebacker or a pass rusher. So it's that and just simply the fact that just not throwing their way. Yeah, they're taking away one guy like I mentioned before, but how much are they really doing to affect the entirety of the game is something that I think is a valid doubt to have by NFL teams trying to sign these guys if they want to sign them at the end of the day. Also with the rules, I think a lot of times defensive players get the short end of the stick and are often unfairly criticized, unfairly flagged for being overly aggressive when it seems like there's nothing there. So that, to go along with the evolution of the NFL, favors the offense a little bit more. So having a guy that's making a lot of money but then still getting penalized in that and getting bailed out at the same time, not really shutting a guy down because the rules almost favor the offensive guy, is another thing that I don't think works too much in their favor. But I don't know. I think it's still, like I mentioned, there is still time, 2.5 weeks until we officially start training camp. I think once we get closer, maybe a week or a couple of days out, I'm sure the conversations are being had, but nothing is being solidified. But once we get closer to training camp or halfway through August, you don't hope that somebody gets hurt, but if somebody does, all these guys are going to be looked at a lot more. And I anticipate probably 3 out of the 5 that I mentioned, I probably anticipate at least 3 of them to be signed by the time the regular season starts, if not more. So it's just a waiting game. Teams are hesitant about it, but with unforeseen circumstances, that situation could change. But that's sort of my intel on why I believe right now defensive backs, older ones, are really not being valued as high as pass rushers that are flying off the board and stuff like that. Linebackers are flying off the board, things like that. Offensive linemen, you can name it. That's why I believe that's going in that direction. But let me know what you guys think on why veteran defensive backs, maybe there's something I missed, why you guys think they're not getting the looks that Patrick Peterson thinks that they should be getting. And with that being said, we're going to move on with this segment and the rest of the show. The next topic, the last time, we're going to talk about the first episode of Hard Knocks, what went down in a conversation within the Giants about potentially adding Christian Wilkins, why they decided to go away from him, and my thoughts on it overall with how that conversation broke down and just my final thoughts on the Giants before we move on and talking about the second episode later in this week. So that is coming up after this break. We'll be right back.